In this lesson, we will be looking at macroevolution. This is chapter 10.7, 10.12 through 10.14. New species arise through the process of macroevolution or speciation. Speciation is when one species splits into two distinct species. This occurs in two distinct phases. First, there must be reproductive isolation. Second, there's genetic divergence, which is the accumulation of many genetic differences in the two populations that have been separated out. Generally, this requires more than just evolutionary change in the population. Remember, we have to have reproductive isolation as well. There are two major ways that speciation can occur. The first is allopatric speciation. This is speciation with geographic isolation. During allopatric speciation, reproductive isolation occurs due to a physical barrier dividing up the population. After the physical division of the two populations, we see natural selection acting in different ways, causing the accumulation of genetic variations in the two groups. Eventually, these two groups will become so different that they will no longer be able to reproduce, even if they did wind up back in the same area. One example is shown here. The Isthmus of Panama has divided many groups of organisms in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Because of the geographic isolation, these animals and plants have also been reproductively isolated, and natural selection has worked on them differently, providing us with different species. Here we see another example of allopatric speciation. We start with one initial population of ground squirrels. They are all fairly similar, although there are some genetic variations within the population. There's reproductive isolation due to some geographic barrier. In this case, there's a river that these animals will not cross. The two populations have genetic divergence. Over time, we see that either side of the river has a distinct population, and they are no longer genetically the same. Eventually, these animals will not be able to interbreed, and we have two different species of ground squirrels evolve. Allopatric speciation is also common on islands. When a group or population of birds is isolated on an island from the mainland population, they will often adapt rapidly to their new environment. We've seen this happen with Darwin's finches out in the Galapagos Islands and out on other island chains like Hawaii. The second type of speciation is sympatric speciation. This is when new species arise even though there is no geographical barrier. There are three ways that sympatric speciation can occur. The first is polyploidy, the second is habitat differentiation, and the third is sexual selection. Polyploidy occurs when there is an error in cell division, particularly in plants. Animals tend to be less tolerant of this process, and the embryos usually die early in development. Plants, though, can tolerate polyploidy, and this process has given us many new species. Polyploidy results in an increase in the number of chromosomes. Offsprings are not able to reproduce with parent species, so they often self-fertilize, leading to a new population and a new species. Here's an example of polyploidy. We have a parent species with a diploid number of 2n equals 6 chromosomes. There is an error during meiosis, which results in a problem dividing up the chromosomes. This means that the gametes will have the wrong number of chromosomes. If self-fertilization occurs, the plant will then fertilize its own egg and sperm cells, resulting in a tetraploid plant that has 4n equals 12, so twice as many chromosomes as the original parent plant. Humans have learned to use polyploidy to our advantage. There are some types of plants, usually seedless ones, that have occurred due to a polyploidy event. These seedless plants are sterile, but it's usually good for us to eat. For example, seedless watermelons don't have seeds for us to spit out, but it is a sterile plant, so we have to find other ways to keep that line going. Habitat differentiation occurs when different groups within the population pick different parts of the habitat or different resources to use. A classic example of this are apple maggot flies. These flies started out growing on hawthorn trees, which are native to North America. When apples were introduced, the flies started using apples as a food source as well. However, some of the flies prefer the apples, while others prefer the hawthorn fruit. We see now that gene flow is being reduced between these two groups of flies. Even though there is no physical barrier dividing up the two groups, they prefer different fruit and self-separate based on that habitat preference. So we see that the flies that are born and raised on apples tend to mate and prefer other flies from apples, while flies born and raised on hawthorn fruit tend to prefer other flies on hawthorn fruit. The third way we can have sympatric speciation occur is through sexual selection. This is when organisms are picky about their mates. This leads to separation based on certain traits. So in this example with the lizards, we have blue lizards and green lizards. The females are going to choose mates that look like them. So blue lizards will mate with blue lizards and green lizards will mate with green lizards. There is no physical barrier dividing these two groups. This again is all preference based on coloration or some other flashy trait and female choice. Eventually we see that reproductive isolation occurs, and these organisms will start to have genetic differentiation as well. So differences will occur between the two groups, and eventually they will not be able to reproduce together, causing the speciation event or formation of two different species. We can see in the fossil record that the pace of evolution is not constant. In some groups of organisms, we see gradual changes, so evolution creeps by with slow, minute changes over time. This is called the gradual model. We also see periods of punctuated equilibrium, where evolution speeds up rapidly, having very quick changes over shorter periods, with breaks in between where there is very little to no change. We call this the punctuated equilibrium model. Adaptive radiations are times of extreme diversification, when small numbers of species change rapidly into much larger numbers of species. Adaptive radiations are an example of punctuated equilibrium, where one or few species radiate outward and differentiate very rapidly in evolutionary history. 3 phenomena can trigger adaptive radiations. We're going to look at mass extinctions, colonization events, and evolutionary innovations. All of these result in access to plentiful new resources, which opens up the opportunity for speciation to occur. Mass extinctions are when a large natural disaster or other event causes the sudden elimination of many groups of species. We see several mass extinctions throughout history. When some groups go extinct, this opens up resources for other groups to use. A good example of this is after the extinction of dinosaurs, mammals went through an adaptive radiation. They stepped up and started using all of the resources that were left available when the dinosaurs died. Because of this, mammals went from very small and very few numbers of species to a huge diversity of mammals that we now see today. Colonization events can also lead to adaptive radiations. This happens when colonizers find a large number of opportunities for adaptation and diversification. We've seen this in the Galapagos finches and in Hawaii with different groups such as fruit flies or birds. When a new organism arrives in a new location, this founding population has an abundant amount of resources available to them. This allows for adaptive radiation and the differentiation of different parts of the population to specialize on certain resources. The last thing we're going to look at is evolutionary innovation. With the evolution of new innovative features, we see an increase in fitness, and a species can rapidly diversify and speciation occurs. One example of this is the innovation of wings and a rigid skeleton structure that appears in insects. The hard skeleton is very protective, and wings allow these animals to reach brand new resources that were not available to them before. This type of diversification has led to more than 800,000 species of insects alive today. Here's a practice question. The evolution of flight in birds would likely be considered adaptive radiation as a result of which phenomena? Correct. Evolutionary innovation. Remember, birds evolved from a type of dinosaur. Dinosaurs could not fly, but birds could. This opens up new resources for the birds and allowed for adaptive radiation to occur. Let's talk a little more about mass extinctions. There have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history, and it's argued that we are currently going through a 6th mass extinction. There are 2 types of extinctions that we can look at. Mass extinctions are when a large number of species become extinct over a short period of time due to extraordinary and sudden environmental changes. We also see that there are background extinctions going on all the time. These extinctions occur at lower rates during times other than mass extinctions. Every year we lose a certain number of species, and this is our background extinction. We can see from this graph here that there have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history. Remember, background extinctions occur naturally at lower rates during periods other than during mass extinctions. These generally result from natural selection. Some groups will be outcompeted by other groups, either new species or other species moving into areas, and this can cause them to go extinct. Mass extinctions generally occur due to rapid climate change. There are many things or events that can cause this climate change to occur. For example, when the dinosaurs went extinct, a large meteor hit Earth and landed in the Gulf of Mexico. This caused such a disruption and threw up so much sediment into the Earth's atmosphere that global climate change occurred. Global climate change caused the extinction of dinosaurs and many other species. Another cause of mass extinctions was the supervolcanoes erupting. Again, this disrupted Earth's atmosphere and caused global climate change at a very rapid rate, causing mass extinctions throughout the globe. It is argued that we are currently going through a 6th mass extinction due to human interactions. Humans are causing global climate change, and we are causing many organisms to go extinct due to destruction of habitat and pollution as well. If we continue at our current rate, we may lose more species than we can count. Here's a practice question. Mass extinctions could be considered blank, whereas background extinctions are caused by blank. The correct answer is D, or 4. Mass extinctions could be considered genetic drift. Random natural disasters occur and cause bottleneck effects in extinctions and wiping out organisms. Background extinctions are caused by natural selection. In summary, this lesson has looked at macroevolution. We've looked at different ways that speciation can occur. We've also looked at adaptive radiations and mass extinctions. Be sure to review the learning objectives posted in Blackboard to help you study for this lesson.